I would say that renewable energy is on the plate of every government in the world today. Coal is not an efficient resource. It produces tons of greenhouse gases. And at the end of the day, it may very well be the death of us all. As a result, states look to alternatives, whether that be solar, wind and air, or hydroelectric. Comparatively, these are all very good, but cost is a huge issue to all points. Granted, there's also biofuels and geothermal, but in the long run, respectively, biofuels are difficult to maintain, and geothermal can only be set up in specific areas. But there's another option, and that would be nuclear fission. The Department of Clean Energy does recognize nuclear fission as a viable alternative. But I think all of us can agree today that when we think nuclear, we think of it as a byword for uncertainty, disaster. It's not clean energy that we think of. It's a ticking time bomb. With that in mind, my goal here today is to address, is this valid? Should we be thinking these things? And furthermore, could nuclear fission perhaps be our saving grace? Let's look at the facts for a bit. First of all, nuclear fission is primarily promoted as the disaster energy. You can see this across many sites. The soccer moms talk about it notably. But when you come down to it, there's only 3 disasters that have really promoted this. 3 Mile Island in 1979, the Chernobyl incident in 1986, and most recently, Fukushima in 2011. Many people will promote a lot of statistics from this. That Chernobyl had to be completely evacuated and that it released over 5% of its contents into downstream air. That Fukushima has created a blast zone radius and has caused the evacuation of thousands of residents, and in some cases deaths. But truly, this is ignorance of the real evidence. Chernobyl was run by people who didn't know what they were doing, with inefficient equipment and outdated protocol. 3 Mile Island resulted in no deaths and was very quickly cleaned up. And as for Fukushima, a 9.0 earthquake typically tends to cause a little bit of damage. When we get down to it, these incidents are not the rule, they're flukes. And we do not judge a rule by its exceptions. So, what are the real problems with nuclear energy then? For one, we can look at fuel. And I will grant that there are issues, once again, with nuclear energy in total. Fuel is probably the biggest issue. It's a finite resource. Unlike air, it's not infinite. Unlike solar, it's not infinite. You need uranium-235, 233, or plutonium-239. All of these isotopes are very efficient and, unfortunately, very finite at the same time. At the same time, you also have cost. A single nuclear energy plant can cost upwards of $9 billion compared to a single coal plant at $2 billion. And then you have waste. Waste is probably the biggest issue out of all of them. Regardless of what it is, either immediate waste or intensive waste, there's a grading scale. It either takes 15 years under a drum in water to then be filled in a landfill of concrete, or if it's contaminated goggles, you again put it in a barrel and then put it in a landfill. You cannot get rid of this stuff. That's probably the biggest issue. But we're going to address all those problems immediately and effectively. First of all, fuel is not finite, really, at least for not our purposes. Uranium and plutonium, and neptunium to its extent, are finite. I will grant this. However, we have made advancements. It's not 1979, it's not 1986 anymore, people. We have thorium. Thorium is a very efficient fuel source, which is practically infinite and can be used for many purposes. In fact, Transatomic Energy, an independent private company at this moment, is actually producing 4.8 tons of waste compared to a low water boiler, which produces usually about 10 tons of waste. It's an enormous difference. Alternatively, we can look to molten salt reactors, which are much more efficient and again, produce less waste. But in the end, the fuel source is not finite. Again, for our purposes, they are essentially infinite. To the same degree, air is also infinite, solar is also infinite, and hydroelectric is practically infinite. And in the same way, nuclear is basically infinite. Now let's address price of cost. Now, again, very true, $9 billion compared to a coal plant at $2 billion. But what about price per kilowatt? When we're comparing the price per kilowatt, a coal plant costs 21 cents per kilowatt. A nuclear plant, 2 cents. That difference is astounding. And for taxpayers and for the average consumer alike, it can mean a very big difference. In the long run, you'll make up the difference in 15 years or less. Now, waste. Again, hard to address. But at the end of the day, you only really have the options of air, solar, hydroelectric, biofuel, and geothermal. And we've all already addressed those problems. Air and solar and hydroelectric are extremely expensive. At the same time, they don't nearly make up the cost difference that nuclear does. So you do have biofuels, but they're extremely inefficient, really. And finally, you have coal, which is not really an option, at least as a clean energy source. So that leaves nuclear. Nuclear producing the least waste for the difference it makes up in the cost effectiveness and with resource infinity. We've seen this model work in other countries even. France is most notable for this, making up over 40% of its entire amount of energy output compared to the US at 14.94%. 14.94% is nothing. But France producing 40% of its power based just on nuclear is amazing. And granted, I'm not going to say that France doesn't have its own anti-nuclear programs, but for the most part, people are extremely pleased with it. It has resulted in many people adopting nuclear is the future. At the end of the day, we need to look forward. We cannot let the mistakes of the past restrict us. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that nuclear is the end-all be-all, because frankly it isn't. What I see as the end-all be-all is possibly solar energy being adopted at some point to a massive scale. But that's not effective right now. Nuclear, whether it be a long-term solution or even just a transitional solution, is a solution nonetheless. And we cannot set aside such differences and just ignoring it and not giving it any regard. Politicians sit there in these committees and they say to each other that nuclear isn't worth its salt, that it couldn't be an option because of what happened years ago, decades ago, in fluke accidents. To the taxpayer and consumer, it's what matters: money. And money is something that nuclear can provide, and clean energy. Let's start making the educated choice.